This is the first in a mini-series about auditory differences and the Sounds Right programme. For those who don't know me, my name's Stella Waterhouse and I'm a second-generation educator and autism awareness expert, specialising in auditory differences. Even as a child, I was aware that certain situations made me very uptight, though I simply didn't understand why. All I knew was that in a classroom full of noises, with chairs creaking, books rustling and pens scratching, I just couldn't concentrate properly. That I hated the school dining room because sitting opposite someone when they were eating was really unpleasant. That some music was so painful that I either avoided it or had to stick my fingers in my ears to block it out. Those problems remained throughout my teens and well into my adult life. But like most people, I simply adapted to the constrictions they placed on me. Being a natural introvert, it wasn't actually too much of a hardship to try and avoid the things that other people seemingly found pleasurable, like concerts, parties or eating out. Although had I been more of an extrovert, I would probably have found it very hard indeed. Over the years, I sometimes wondered fleetingly why most people liked nothing more than spending an evening out with friends in a nice restaurant. Didn't they hear the noise as the people with them chomped and gnashed? Why they enjoyed going to concerts or the opera and didn't even block their ears at the painful bits? But like many others, I pushed those thoughts aside as I got on with enjoying my life and work. In fact, it was only when approaching 50 that I decided to write a short booklet on the links between autism and anxiety, something that has now grown into several full-length books, as well as a shorter series for parents and teachers. However, once I began my research, I suddenly discovered a fascinating and frightening new world. The world of autism, a world ruled by sensory differences. A place where what the child hears is not necessarily what you hear, where what the child sees is not necessarily what you see, where how the child experiences a hug is far removed from your loving feelings as the hugger. So it was that one evening, sitting in my living room with research books all around me, I had my epiphany. Everything I was reading about was describing much of my sensory differences. And yet I don't have autism, nor Asperger's syndrome. So how on earth could that be? Intrigued, I went back to my books. More research, more reading. The results amazed me. First, those sensory differences were, and are, far more widespread than I expected, affecting people from all walks of life. Secondly, they came in varying degrees and could affect either just one sense or several. In one group are people who often have physical symptoms like migraine or travel sickness alongside their sensory differences. Indeed, I used to describe those sensory differences as mild, but that hardly does justice to the wide-ranging effects that they can have on a person's life. In another are people whose auditory differences cause a variety of speech and language problems, all of which result in mishearing what is said, something that can often cause misunderstandings. Some amusing, some confusing, and at worst can even lead to arguments or disputes, as when one person hears something that they misinterpret as rude or disparaging. There are several reasons for such problems. It could happen because the person has difficulty discriminating between specific sounds, hears sounds more clearly with one ear than the other, or has a slight deafness that has gone unnoticed. Our speech reflects our hearing, so if you are unable to hear the rise and fall of voices or the emotions they convey, you will not only be left struggling to speak clearly, but also be at a real disadvantage in our social world. And that can make daily life and relationships extremely hard at times. Auditory differences often affect children with learning differences like ADHD or dyslexia too, although the most severe auditory differences are often found in people on the autism spectrum. So what did that tell me about myself? Simply that I had had hyperacusis, that's a hypersensitivity to sound, for as long as I could remember, although I never knew it. And that, of course, explained just why I disliked some sounds, hated sopranos, avoided certain situations whenever I could, and simply had to get away if a dog began panting when I was anywhere near it. All things which, alongside my physical symptoms, put me squarely into the first category. While the precise cause of my sensory differences is unclear, it is fairly obvious that there are some family links. For, whilst migraines run throughout several generations, I have clearly inherited hyperacusis from my mother. She has had it all her life, and, even now that she is fairly deaf, can still hear some sounds very well indeed. So finally I had managed to identify one aspect of my problem. Fascinating, but not really any help in dealing with its effects. However, once again my interest in autism was to provide an answer. I had always believed that the best way to understand just what it felt like to be autistic would be to read the accounts of people who lived with it on a daily basis. But in the late 1980s, the biggest snag was that very few autobiographies existed. So I also talked to many of the autism parents that I knew and read as many parents' accounts as I could find. And it was there that I hit gold, for among them was a biography written by Annabelle Stelly, whose daughter Georgie had autism. She describes the various sensory problems that Georgie had, most notably her hypersensitivity to sound, which was later identified as a major factor in her autistic withdrawal and behaviours. As Georgie told her mom, the sound was the only thing that drove me crazy because I was so scared, and sound was going on all the time. It was hard to get away from it. Fortunately, at the age of 12, Georgie underwent a treatment which corrected those problems. After treatment, she was able to tell her mom that she was much more comfortable, that she no longer heard street noises 3 blocks away or people flushing their toilets at the other end of the building, or the blood rushing through her veins. Written several years after Georgie had been treated, the book also included details of the who and the how, detailing the work of the late Dr. Guy Berard, a French ear, nose and throat specialist who spent much of his life working with a wide range of people, whose common link was that they all heard and processed sounds in a somewhat unusual way. During the course of his career, Dr. Berard developed a treatment called Auditory Integration Training, or AIT, which he then used successfully for many years with a vast number of patients. Some simply suffered from hyperacusis. Others had associated problems that ranged from speech and language disorders to the learning difficulties I've already mentioned. And that was one of those light bulb moments. The moment I suddenly found that help was available. Help that I'd like to share with you. But before I do that, perhaps I should tell you a little more about the often overlooked and misunderstood problem of hyperacusis. For unless you have experienced it for yourself, you may not fully appreciate how devastating it can be. Meanwhile, please feel free to download the Auditory checklist, which will help you determine whether the Sounds Right programme could help you or your child. If you'd like more information now, you'll find my articles at www.autismdecoded.com or www.autismdailynewscast.com. Meanwhile, thank you for watching.